In September of 1964, what began as a simple hunting trip deep in the Sierra Nevadas turned into a night spent high in a pine tree, with strange, robot-like figures gathering in the brush below. Flip your pillow to the cold side and settle in. This is the High Strangeness Sleep Society. Chapter 1. Into the Sierra. Donald Shrum was about 28 years old in 1964. He lived near Sacramento with his wife and child and worked at Aerojet. Hunting, sports, racing cars, and the outdoors were part of his ordinary life. On the Friday before Labor Day, Shrum drove into the Sierra with two coworkers, Vincent Alvarez and Tim Trueblood. The three men were bow hunting deer. They followed old U.S. Highway 40 toward Cisco Grove, then continued into the high country near the Loch Leven Lakes. Beyond the road, pine and fir grew among granite ridges, steep gullies, and thick manzanita. One ridge could hide another only a short distance away. A route that looked passable could end above a canyon. The weather was dry, and the air would cool quickly after sunset. A thin crescent moon had already set. Once daylight faded, the mountains would be extremely dark. The men hunted through the afternoon and gradually moved apart. Each expected to work his way back to camp, but the terrain soon hid them from one another. Shrum believed he knew the direction of the meeting place and followed a ridge toward it. The ridge ended above ground he could not safely cross. Turning back, he searched for another route through the granite and brush. The detour cost him the remaining daylight. Shrum had missed the way to camp. By then, crossing the steep country in darkness was more dangerous than staying where he was. Shrum decided to wait for morning. A pine stood above a granite outcrop nearby. Its lower trunk was bare for about 12 feet, with branches and a thin crown above. The height offered some protection from animals on the ground. With his bow, arrows, canteen, matches, and hunting clothes, Shrum climbed to the first branches and settled in for the night. No road was visible from the tree. No campfire shone beyond the ridges. His companions were somewhere in the same dark country. For about 2 hours, nothing happened. Then a white light appeared below the northern ridge. Chapter 2. The Light Turns. At first, the light looked like a flashlight or lantern moving between the trees. From the pine, Shrum watched it follow an uneven path toward the west. It would rise above the treetops, then drop from sight behind the terrain. It stayed below the skyline and moved through the broken country. The same ridges hid Shrum's camp and companions. When trees blocked the light, only darkness remained. Then the white point appeared again, farther along the ridge. Shrum kept watching. The light was white and steady. It did not flash or cast a visible beam, and Shrum could see no shape around it. At that distance, a person carrying a light still seemed possible. Then it passed over a tree and dropped again. Its movement suggested another explanation. Shrum began to wonder if a helicopter from the ranger station was searching the mountain country for the three hunters. So far, staying in the pine had been the practical choice. The ridge was dark, his companions were out of sight, and daylight was still hours away. But if the light belonged to a search aircraft, the branches would make him harder to find. Shrum climbed down. On the granite below the pine, he gathered dry material and built 3 separate fires. Each one stood on a large rock with about 10 feet between them. He moved among the rocks until 3 small flames marked his position on the ridge. Then Shrum stood between 2 of the fires and waved both arms toward the moving light. For a moment it continued west. Then it turned. The light began coming toward him from the northwest. For a moment the signal seemed to have worked. Something moving through the mountains had noticed it and changed course. He remained beside the fires as it approached. If it was a helicopter, the sound of its rotors should become clearer as the distance closed. No such sound reached the ridge. The light kept coming. By Shrum's estimate, it stopped 50 or 60 yards away. It hung between 2 trees slightly above his eye level. Even at that distance, the light was all he could see. There was no outline behind it and no engine or rotor noise. The silence changed his view of it. Whatever had responded to the fires was no longer behaving like the rescue aircraft he expected. Shrum left the 3 fires burning and returned to the pine. His bow went into the tree first. Then he pulled himself up after it and settled among the branches. Camouflage covered him from hat to boots, and the dark crown gave him some concealment. Below him, the signal fires still burned on the granite. Beyond them, the white light remained nearby and silent. Chapter 3. Beneath the Tree. What happened next comes from Shrum's account. Below the pine, the 3 signal fires burned on the granite. Brush and manzanita began beyond the rocks. At first, only movement in the brush was visible. Then a short, roughly human shape appeared. Shrum described a pale covering over its body and head, with folds or padding around the arms and joints. The opening around its face was dark. The figure stopped near the manzanita and seemed to handle the branches. A second pale figure appeared beside it. Together they approached the pine and looked up into the tree. Their size was difficult to judge from above, though Shrum estimated they stood about 5 feet tall. Within the dark face openings, the eyes seemed unusually large and dark. He saw no tools or weapons. An occasional cooing sound came from somewhere on the ridge. Shrum compared it to an owl, and the figures seemed to react when it sounded. He also allowed that a real owl might have been calling nearby. Then another shape began moving uphill. It pushed through low plants and against rocks rather than moving around them. To Shrum, its dark, jointed appearance and stiff movement suggested a robot. 2 reddish-orange lights marked its face. The mouth looked square and hinged. One hand resembled a metal glove. The robot-like figure moved to one signal fire and swept an arm through the embers. Then it came back toward the pine, while the pale figures watched from beyond the rocks. Shrum said the dark figure raised one hand to its face. White vapor came through its open mouth, and the breeze carried it into the branches. Shrum gasped and briefly lost consciousness. When he came around, his bow and the branches were holding him in place. He felt sick. Until then, Shrum had mostly watched from hiding. Now he began using whatever he had to hold the figures back. Fire appeared to work. First, Shrum lit a whole book of matches and dropped it through the branches. The pale figures moved away from the flames. His cap came next. Shrum thought hairdressing in the cloth made it burn brightly, and the figures retreated beyond the rocks. When the flame faded, they returned. Next, Shrum tore strips from his camouflage clothing. He lit them and dropped them through the branches, followed by paper from his wallet. One small fire caught in the sparse brush and held the figures back until it went out. Then they returned again. The pale figures made several attempts to reach the lowest branch. In Shrum's account, they tried to lift each other up the trunk. When Shrum shook the tree, they drew back. Shrum then broke off small limbs and threw down whatever remained in his pockets. Shrum dropped his canteen. One pale figure picked it up, examined it with the other, and tossed it aside. Shrum shouted and made noises. Coyotes called in the distance. Shrum imitated them, hoping the sound might suggest someone else was nearby. With most of what he could burn already gone, Shrum reached for his bow. 3 arrows remained. The robot-like figure stood near the rocks at the foot of the tree. Shrum estimated it was about 12 feet away. Shrum fired the first arrow. It struck the figure's upper body, and a bright flash appeared at the point of impact. The figure moved backward against the rocks. Shrum had training in arc welding and compared the flash to an electric welding arc. The dark figure returned to its place. Shrum fired the second arrow, then the third. Each impact produced another flash, and each time the figure moved back before returning. The pale figures withdrew when the arrows struck. With no arrows and little left to burn, Shrum climbed higher. Near the thin upper trunk, he removed his belt and fastened himself to the tree. If he lost consciousness again or fell asleep from exhaustion, the belt might keep him from falling. The night then settled into a pattern. A pale figure approached the trunk, and Shrum shook the tree or dropped something. The robot-like figure came closer, vapor rose, and Shrum blacked out. Each gap in memory ended with him waking sick. Movement also came from farther out in the brush. Shrum could not tell whether the same figures were circling the ridge or whether others were there. The 3 signal fires went dark. The smaller fires made from clothing and paper went out next. Only the illuminated surfaces and occasional flashes remained in the darkness. The pattern continued without a reliable measure of time as the eastern sky slowly changed. Near dawn, Shrum saw 2 dark, robot-like forms facing each other near the pine. The area between them filled with bright arc-like flashes, and a thick white cloud rose into the branches. He lost consciousness again. When Shrum woke, his arms and legs hung loose. The belt held his weight against the trunk. The sky was light, though the sun had not risen. The ground below was empty, the sounds had stopped, and the lights were gone. Chapter 4. Morning. Shrum stayed in the tree for a while after daylight, watching the rocks and brush. Nothing moved. After releasing the belt, Shrum worked his way down through the thin branches. Much of his outer camouflage was gone, burned piece by piece during the night. He was cold, exhausted, and still sick to his stomach. The remains of the 3 signal fires lay below the pine. Burned paper and pieces of clothing were scattered among the rocks, and one patch of low brush was scorched. Smoke still rose near one rock. For a moment, Shrum mistook it for movement before recognizing his own fire. Shrum picked up his bow and canteen. One fired arrow was caught in the top of the manzanita. After recovering it, he looked for the direction of camp. Daylight gave the land its usual shape again. The deep shadows became granite shelves, scattered pines, manzanita, and the slope he had climbed the night before. The distance to camp was the same, but he could read the route once more. With the bow, canteen, and recovered arrow, Shrum began walking toward camp. Exhaustion forced him to stop before he reached it, and he lay down among the trees to rest. In his later recollection, a whistle came through the woods. Shrum answered. Vincent Alvarez was nearby, and the two men worked toward each other through the trees. At camp, Tim Trueblood had also returned. 4 years later, Alvarez wrote that he found Shrum heading toward camp. He remembered Shrum wearing only a thin t-shirt and pants, weak and exhausted after the cold night. Alvarez helped him back to camp, made soup, and put him to sleep. Shrum kept saying that he would have been all right if they had left him alone. Alvarez did not yet know what he meant, so the companions let him rest. After about 6 hours, Shrum woke. His companions asked about the missing clothing, and Shrum told them what he remembered. In the same letter, Alvarez said he had also become lost and had seen a light while working through the canyon toward camp. Shrum remembered Alvarez comparing it to a shooting star that seemed too low and lasted too long. Alvarez described no figures or activity beneath the pine. Trueblood was reported to have seen nothing unusual. Trueblood's own account has not been found. The three hunters broke camp and headed back toward the old highway in Sacramento. Chapter 5. Telling Someone. Back home on Saturday, Shrum told his wife what had happened in the mountains. The family tried to find someone who might know what to do with the story. They later told Victor Killick that Shrum had come home as pale as a sheet and badly shaken. The family believed him, but they did not know where to take an account like his. Shrum's mother-in-law called the Sacramento Union. She said her son-in-law had seen strange lights during a hunting trip the previous night and asked whether anyone else had reported them. Someone at the newspaper referred her to Victor W. Killick, who ran the observatory at Sacramento City College. Killick already knew the family. Shrum's mother-in-law reached him at home. Killick first compared her question with a meteor report from another night. The timing did not fit. After he asked for more detail, she called Shrum to the telephone. Shrum told Killick about the hunting trip, the separation, the tree, and the activity he said had continued through the night. He acknowledged that the story was difficult to believe. Shrum also said he wanted his name kept out of the newspapers. He thought it was his duty to notify someone in authority and have the matter investigated. The following day, Shrum's wife called Killick again and arranged a meeting at his home. Shrum arrived with her and his brother. They brought a Forest Service map. Shrum also brought the arrow with the dented point that he had recovered after leaving the tree. At Killick's home, Shrum used the map to show where the hunt had taken place. The hunting area was south of Cisco off Old Highway 40. Shrum marked the approximate ridge where he said the episode occurred. The map helped him explain how the hunters had separated and why he remained in the pine. Next, Shrum described what he said moved below it. Beside the map was the dented arrow. Shrum went through the events again. Killick listened and asked questions. He later wrote that he had looked for an ulterior motive and found none. He told the family that he remained skeptical and offered to help them seek an official examination. The family accepted his help, provided there was no publicity. Killick then wrote the story in 2 pages. His summary already included the silent light, figures beneath the tree, vapor, burning clothing, and arrows. On September 9th, 5 days after the night on the ridge, he sent those pages to the commanding officer at Mather Air Force Base. Chapter 6. What Investigators Did. The official inquiry was brief. Later that September, an Air Force officer and sergeant met Shrum at his home and recorded his account. Their questions tested several ordinary explanations. The officer asked if the figures might have been teenagers staging a prank or Air Force trainees camping nearby. The questions also covered drinking and hallucination. Shrum rejected these ideas. Later he told Cerny that the setting was too remote for the kind of prank suggested. Shrum asked the Air Force about military exercises and was told there had been no training in the area that night. In his view, a hallucination would not have returned in repeated episodes until morning. Air Force reviewers also considered woodland animals. They asked whether Shrum had mistaken owls, birds, or other animals for the figures, with darkness and imagination shaping what he saw. The officers recorded his answers and accepted 1 arrowhead. The officers did not visit the ridge. The Air Force said recent fire danger prevented a search of the area. The tree, rocks, and surrounding slope were never examined by official investigators. No medical examination followed. The Air Force arrowhead was never laboratory tested. In 1968, the Air Force said it had been loaned to the University of Colorado UFO study and not returned. Civilian investigators had 2 different arrowheads examined. No trace material was found on either. After the interview and the effort to find an ordinary explanation, Project Blue Book classified the encounter as other psychological. The Air Force pointed to owls or other woodland animals along with imagination or psychological causes. Civilian investigators spent considerably more time with Shrum and his family. In 1965, Paul Cerny and David Slett sat down with him at his home and recorded a long interview. They asked Shrum to reconstruct the night in detail. They returned to the terrain, distances, sequence of events, and what he did in response. At times, Shrum was certain of a detail. At others, he said he did not know. 3 more interviews and many other contacts followed. Over time, Cerny came to regard Shrum as honest and sincere, not someone planning a hoax. It was a judgment about Shrum, not an answer to what he had encountered. J. Allen Hynek discussed Cisco Grove in his 1977 book, The Hynek UFO Report. After years as Project Blue Book's scientific consultant, he found Shrum's story difficult to believe. But he also questioned whether the interviews had been studied closely enough to support such a firm psychological conclusion. Hynek remained skeptical of the encounter, but did not treat the official explanation as firmly established. The Air Force settled on a psychological explanation. The civilian investigators stopped at a judgment about Shrum's sincerity. Neither approach established what had been beneath the tree. Beyond that, the night on the ridge remained Shrum's account. Chapter 7. Mr. X. Shrum could have become part of the public story in 1964. Keeping his name out of it was his choice. His reasons were practical. A wife, a young child, a home, and steady work at Aerojet made up his ordinary life. Shrum expected ridicule and feared that publicity could affect his job. Cerny described him as quiet and somewhat shy, and Shrum repeatedly asked to stay out of public view. Shrum continued cooperating in private. He spoke with Killick, the Air Force, and civilian investigators. His cooperation included answers, maps, arrowheads, and recorded interviews. Publication came with one condition: leave out his name. His wife also kept the account moving. After reading a January 1965 article by Major Donald Kehoe, she wrote to his organization, NICAP, that May. Her letter eventually brought Paul Cerny to the family. Cerny and David Slett then recorded the long interview that preserves Shrum's detailed account of the night. The first public version appeared in the APRO Bulletin in the summer of 1966. At Shrum's request, the hunter was identified only as Mr. X. The name kept his ordinary life separate from the encounter. Donald Shrum continued going to work. Mr. X became the hunter in the tree, known only through the encounter. Later retellings changed some details. The early accounts described separate lights, bright rectangular panels, and something moving down from them. A clearly defined, cigar-shaped parent craft appeared much later. One magazine also described metal on an arrowhead. Civilian testing found no trace material on the two tips it examined. Shrum marked a copy of the published account to show details he believed were wrong. He continued avoiding publicity, and requests from reporters went unanswered. Decades passed. In later life, Shrum said the night had stayed with him. To the public, the witness remained Mr. X. That changed in 2011. Almost 47 years after the encounter, Aliens in the Forest appeared with Donald Shrum named as a co-author. Shrum was then in his 70s, and the book presented later memories alongside the earlier account. For nearly half a century, the hunter in the tree had been Mr. X. Donald Shrum's name now appeared beside the story. Chapter 8: The Ridge. And so we return to the deep Sierra Nevada mountains where this story began. Back to the granite ridges and tall pines above the old highway. In daylight, there is little about this country to suggest the strange night Donald Shrum described. Just miles of forest and rock, with narrow trails disappearing between the trees. Nearly everything about that night depends on the account of one man who found himself alone in those mountains after dark. What he experienced there remains unresolved, and perhaps that's a good place to leave it. With the morning light back on the ridge. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of the episode. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing. It really does help the channel grow, and it helps more people find these quiet stories of high strangeness. For now, there is nothing more you need to solve tonight. Good night. Sleep well.